I call in member for Wright.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I thank you. Deputy Speaker, I rise today to speak on the tax law amendments, Bill 2012 and the Income Tax Managed Investment Trust Withholding Amendment Bill 2012. Mr Deputy Speaker, this bill here before us epitomises the performance of this government in this parliament. This bill epitomises it because this bill has potentially had more starts than black caviar. This bill, it's like going. I went to a tennis game at Rather Stadium and watched the women's semi-final last year. And standing at those doors, watching this bill come in, go out, come in, go out, come in, go out, is nothing short of a tennis match. And I know deep in my heart that members of the opposite side of this House, members of this government, are embarrassed about the way that this bill has been managed through its process in this House. They must be. They must be. Because there are a lot of things to be embarrassed about. There are. But this bill, not only does it embarrass us as a parliament for the way that this bill has conducted its transition through the House, but when we speak in this room, it's not just a local audience, it is a national audience and it is a global audience. And when a bill comes before the House that speaks to managed investments trusts and the imposition of tax on those companies choosing to invest in this nation, it is a matter of national importance and it is a matter of sovereign risk. The Income Tax Managed Investment Trust Withholding Tax Amendment Bill 2012 amends the Income Tax Management Investment Trust Withholding Tax Act 2008 to increase the Management Investment Trust final withholding tax from 7.5% to 15% on funds payments made in relation to income years that commenced after July 2012. Well, one of the things we can be thankful for, Mr Speaker, at least there's not an element of retrospectivity associated to this, as there are many other pieces of legislation that come before this House. At least we can be thankful for that. In Schedule 1 to Tax Law Amendments, Managed Investment Trust Withholding Tax makes consequential amendments to the Taxation Administration Act of 1953 to give effect to the increase in the consequential MIT final withholding tax rate imposed by the Income Tax Managed Investment Trust Withholding Tax Amendment 2012. According to the budget, it's expected to generate approximately $260 million in revenue over the forward estimates. Now, I only suspect that the reason that we're in here having this debate and that the reason that the bill has hit is because of the $260 million that it's forecasted to bring in. But I will bring evidence during the debate, evidence that has come from the financial sectors of this nation that says this government is prepared to blow off $1 billion in lost revenue, flighted revenue, international revenue that would have come to this nation to pick up $260 million. How does that work? When we start making financial decisions, because the political survival of this government is so thinly strung to a forecasted $1.5 billion surplus, their political credibility, Mr Speaker, is eminently nucleused around that figure. It is nucleused around that figure. And this $260 million helps in generating that revenue. But in order to do it, they're prepared to sacrifice $1 billion worth of revenue, and I'll tell you who said that. Yes, that's right, Deputy Speaker. The MIT final withholding tax rate of 15% will apply to fund payments made in relation to income years that commence on or after July 2012. That seems like a special and memorial date for this government. The start of the world's largest carbon tax, as we all know, kicks off on that date. The start of the investment withdrawal in Australia, and yet another tax that will have a snowball effect on investment and increase our exposure to sovereign risk. 101 economics tells us that when you're trying to stimulate an economy, and we have a two-tiered economy at the moment, we have the resources sector, which is considerably strong, and then we have another sector of the community, which is my community, the community of Wright, the electorate of Wright, which has little or no linkages into the resources sector. 101 economics tells us when you're trying to stimulate an economy, there are two things that you do. One is you decrease tax and you increase government spending. Well, we got the increased government spending because we can go through a myriad of wasteful spending activities that this government has participated in. But there was a reduction in tax rate that we were supposed to see, and I believe it was the reduction in the company tax rate from 30 to 29%. But then again, it's like going to the tennis semi-finals as well. It's in again, out again, in again, out again, depending on where the polls are at the moment. I mean, in Queensland more recently, we had the Prime Minister up there speaking to business leaders about they should be out there talking up the economy and how well things are going. Well, I can assure you, Mr Speaker, when you walk up the streets of Bow Desert, when you walk up and down the streets of Gatton, which is predominantly farming rural precinct, when you get up onto the tourism sector of Mount Tamborina, my electorate, these people are doing it extremely tough. And I forecast here tonight that we are going to see double-digit figures of businesses exiting the market. And if you want to get into a booming business at the moment, go and get yourself into some shares into some receivables business or administrators, because they're going to be going gangbusters as a result of some of this government policy. In 2008, when Labor previously reduced the tax rate of withholding tax progressively from 30 to 7.5%, the Coalition did not oppose the relevant bill. We didn't oppose it because it was done in an orderly fashion. We sent messages to the market in an orderly fashion and said that it would be staged down. This wake up out of bed type of haphazard approach and saying, today, we might just double that withholding tax rate. That's a good idea, because we've run out of ideas, Mr Speaker. As a government, they have run out of ideas. However, at the time we did express concerns that the reduction was not a genuine reduction for international taxpayers because of the operational double taxation agreements, and any reduction in taxation paid in Australia may simply lead to higher taxes being paid just to other jurisdictions. Deputy Speaker, at the time, the Coalition also expressed concerns that the bill had not been subject to proper scrutiny, as Labor had not allowed the bill to be considered by the Senate Economics Committee, that Labor's costing of the measures would be dubious, and that Labor had delivered a tax cut to foreigners in the 2008 budget that had not delivered a tax cut to Australian citizens and taxpayers. When will this Labor government realise that the continual changes to our international taxation arrangements, coupled with Labor's recent retrospective tax grab, reduce international investor confidence and relative concerns about Australia's sovereign risk profile? It was interesting. I sit on the Economic Committee, and it was interesting to hear from industries and the private sector about their concerns with the proposed legislative changes. Treasury indicated it expected little negative influence on investment flows from the increase. This position was vigorously rejected by industry, and I will quote from a passage of Hansard in the inquiry. But I do that. Before I do that, Treasury indicated little negative influence on the investment flows from the increase. This position was vigorously rejected by industry. Now, how often do we see that happen, Mr Speaker, where we have Treasury come out with one set of position or a set of forecast and industry adamantly opposing it? I mean, we don't have to look too much further than last year's forecast of what this deficit was going to be. Back before the last budget, I think we had forecast for this budget to be in and around the vicinity of $10 billion. I mean, 6 months later, we're looking at a figure of $22.7 billion. This is from the same department, virtually doubled within a 6-month period. 22.7, and then when the recent MyEFO documents come out, it's bounced out to $37 billion. So this is, again, Treasury being in contrast to industry with reference to the credibility of forecasting. And of course, I mean, who knows what the last figure is going to end up here with the budget deficit for this year's. Who knows what the budget deficit is going to end up? I think it's going to be somewhere in the vicinity of $44 billion. But with this government cooking the books and trying to bring revenue or expenditure back from next year into this, well, I opened my comments by saying the government, that this bill was similar to Mackay v Diva. I'd be putting a pun on whichever figure bloody I thought that that Treasury could change horses. So I left you with a position where we had a conflict of Treasury and the industry. This exchange between Anthony McDonald, Treasurer, and Peter Viewer, the Chief Executive of Property Council of Australia. Mr McDonald said, "I'm not aware there probably would be, but in this instance, to the extent that we would have allowed for any reduction into this sector as a result of the budget measures, it would be fairly minimal." Now, fairly minimal, but for a $260 million pickup in tax revenue, I ask you, how do you quantify what is fairly minimal? I went on to say that I know it might sound strange to those directly involved in the sector because you're looking at the net impact across the economy rather than the impact across the sector. So don't look at it across the economy, look at it across the whole GDP. I mean, it's similar to what the government does with reference to rationalising its debt ratio and saying, oh, it's only 7% or it's only 10% of GDP. So if you take this as a rational comparison against not the number that it should have been used as a common denominator, but the whole economy, of course it's only minimal. But this is how we use the logic that we're using to try and rationalise the unrationalism. Again, we're looking at the financial flows. There would be a greater reduction in the flows that occurred through managed investment trusts, that we are interested in what happens to the aggregate base, and that is a different thing. Mr Viewer, the question was, where would that extra money come from in order to ensure that the aggregate base remained in alignment? We're still waiting for that answer. We're still waiting for that answer. Mr Donald, that is part of being a small open economy that is engaged in international capital markets with a freely floating exchange rate does. There were some other comments there, but it is not in fact these foreign investors that have said to us quite clearly that some of them already pulled out because we had no longer meet their hurdle rates. It didn't take long to do the sums. Others said that they'd frozen their negotiations. And to support those comments that had been frozen, I draw your attention to the Hansard, which one of the coalition, one of the members of the Economics Committee asked of Mr. Martin Cordina from the Financial Services Council, and he asked, "Is there any evidence of the flight of capital occurring as a result of this legislation?" And this is where the $1 billion comes in. Mr. Cordina said, "There is absolute evidence of that. Collectively, we have quantified in excess of $1 billion, some of which has been made public and some of which is highly sensitive because of the nature of foreign investors. In some cases, you have sovereign funds. In other words, it would be akin to a foreign government being critical of the Australian government as a consequence of the change." Now, why am I only just hearing about this in an economics hearings, where the Financial Services Council of Australia is giving evidence? Why wasn't these opinions sought from the consultation process? Why wasn't it consulted? Why weren't these people consulted? Because when you talk to Treasury, normally they always open up with, "Oh, we've consulted with the industries, we've consulted with everyone, we've consulted this to death." Mr Cordina later went on to say, let me put it this way, "We are disappointed that we were not consulted prior to the announcement being made on budget night. Since this government came into office in 2007, we had issued something like 10 media releases which were supportive of subsequent changes that have been made, either to our tax system or regulatory-wise, that essentially had their origins from the Johnson's Review. We were one of the leading principals in the Johnson's Review, involved in much of the work that was conducted there. So I guess I can say it did come as a surprise as an organisation that actively involved in assisting this government in that area, that announcement was made without prior consultation." Well, why would a government not consult with major stakeholders on such a sensitive bill that has the capacity to generate $1 billion of flight in capital from this nation? I'll tell you why. To save the budget bottom line, Mr Speaker. I can think of no other reason. To save the budget bottom line of a measly $260 million. The government's constant chopping and changing in relation to the MIT withholding tax has again reduced our predictability in the eyes of international investors. If passed, this bill would undermine Australia's objective in becoming a regional financial hub in the Asian Pacific region. Attracting more foreign investment is important to achieve stronger economic growth, which would lead to increased government revenue without the need for many new tax increases. Industry was barely consulted, the Australian people are rarely consulted, and the Coalition remains opposed to this bill.
The member's time has expired.